You're listening to episode 44 of the Confident Writer podcast with Jane Pike. Team Fabulous, how goes it out there today? I was thinking about what to talk about in today's episode, and what I've settled on is a topic that's very close to my heart, and actually one that I wrote about and had a huge amount of feedback on last week, and that is the emotional discharge of anxiety to anger. Where the initial thought came to write that article was, or where that came from rather, was I was tagged in a post on Facebook, which happens periodically. And this particular one was a mum posting about the challenges she was having with her daughter at competition. Now, her daughter was suffering from a huge amount of performance or competition anxiety, which in and of itself is a really common situation. But the way that was manifesting was that she was kind of unpleasant to be around and she was taking out all of her frustrations on her mum. Those of us who are parents are pretty well versed in what that feels like. But, you know, on the flip side of that, we also have been in situations where we haven't acted or behaved as our best selves because we've felt vulnerable or under threat, or we've had these anxieties and fears coursing through our systems that just felt like too much to deal with in the moment, and our level of capacity to do so felt compromised to the point that when we were provoked in some way, even in a really well-intentional way, we may have reacted in ways that weren't in alignment with how it is we'd actually like to be showing up in the world. I know I have done that on occasion, and I'm sure that most of you out there have felt the same. All of us, actually. You know, I think this is a really human condition. What really didn't really surprise me, I guess, but what made me feel a little bit sad in my heart was reading through the comments and noticing how hardline they were. It was like, well, that's completely unacceptable. You need to leave her to her own devices and teach her a lesson, you know, kind of extract yourself from the situation. Or they suggested any number of things which sort of were quite, just real black and white, really a really black and white way of going about things that didn't really understand the cause to my mind, or didn't really show empathy for what it is that was actually going on. Now, a disclaimer here, this, like I said, that post there's completely no judgment around it. I totally get it. I get the motivation for the comments too. But the joy of my work and the great gift that my work has given to me, certainly, is this ability to understand emotions at a much deeper level, and more so than that, be able to recognize when an emotion presents that isn't exactly true for the moment. What I want to talk about today then is that interplay and how it is we can best understand why these situations arise. So why is it that we get frustrated or angry or lash out when we're actually feeling scared and concerned? Why does that happen? And then what's more, how to deal with it when you are on the receiving end of it. And then if you are the one actually perpetuating that kind of situation or playing into that dynamic. It's a really tough gig, and it's a tough gig because we don't have the skills to be able to deal with these kind of high intensity situations. Emotional skills, emotional agility, all of these types of things are not taught. You know, we have a very limited understanding of how it is we can deal with anxiety that doesn't include suppressing or overexpressing it. We don't understand the positive benefits of every emotional state that visits us. And as a consequence, we've become very divided or very black and white in how we see emotions. We view them as good or bad, positive or negative, ones that we want to experience more of, or ones that we want to move away from. And the real game changer for me is understanding emotions as communication. Every emotion is a communication. And the definition that I adhere to, that I've shared with you before, is that emotions essentially are action requiring neurological messages, which means there is a motivating question and an action that is required that is being communicated to you through that feeling state. Now, in order for us to get to this place where we're able to understand what that action is and what that motivating question is, we have to be aware. We have to have developed a degree of emotional competency where we are able to separate ourselves out, so have a degree of differentiation between us and the world, to have a level of internal awareness that shows or tells us when we're feeling something in a specific space. And for many of us, we're essentially cut off at the head. You know, we're caught up in this logical place, this overthinking place where we are disembodied. And it's that re-embodiment, it's that reconnection, that re-understanding. I know that's not a word, but I feel like we've lost the understanding. It's something that's innate to us. And it's that reconnection to all of that stuff which allows us to really be adept and to really see emotions as something that is always working for us, no matter whether we feel like we're in a position where they are or not. Emotions travel in groups. So there is no such thing as a singular feeling state. Everything is connected, everything is fluid. For the sake of explanation, I'm going to make them much more linear than they are, but that's something that I really want to flag up, that emotions travel in groups, and our emotional selves actually exist within this complex interaction of feeling and intuition. And when that is honoured, then we're in a position where we're able to respond effectively and appropriately to the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, in the case of anxiety, the call behind anxiety is one of preparation. It's a future-focused fear that is based either on learned experiences that we're constantly perpetuating into the future, at least mentally, or we are in a situation where we feel under threat in some way, and anxiety comes up as a protective mechanism that calls us to pay attention and asks us what it is we need to prepare or what it is that we need to do in order to move forward safely and effectively for the sake of both ourselves and our horses. Part of this emotional language conversation is being able to filter out what is true for the moment and what is coming as a result of a past story or trauma that is making itself known in our present. Those two things can be interlinked as well. So although it can seem quite complex, actually, once you start to think of life and horses and experience in this way, you really start to tune into what it is that you're feeling, the sensations that are coursing through you, and develop a skill base that allows you to, be really particular about what it is that you're feeling, and that specificity then allows you to take particular action. And when you're able to do that, you stay in flow. There's no reason to suppress emotion. There's no reason that it mutates into something else as a consequence of you not being able to filter that or navigate it effectively. And we're able to move through situations that cause us concern or create feelings of stuckness with much more ease. Now, the problem is that these skills of emotional self-management and navigation, we're not taught these and we don't understand them. This is where fake it till you make it comes in, kind of like these facades of false bravado that we put on. It's where, especially I know in New Zealand and Australia, there's a very DIY approach where it's like, just get on and do it, or kind of man up, move through it, it'll be fine. And really that belies this much more complex and, wide-reaching torrent of emotion, which is never going to go away. Emotion is energy. So if you don't utilize it or you ignore it or suppress it, it goes somewhere else. And this is true of the topic that we're talking about today. It's true of anxiety. And it's the reason why when we aren't able to effectively and competently deal with anxiety, that it often comes to be known in ways that are harmful to us and to other people around us. When we find ourselves in situations of high emotional charge, and when we're unable or unsure how to process that energy to constructive benefit, this is basically a summary of what it is I was just talking about, we look to discharge it by any means available to us, right? So we have this huge availability of energy, this huge liberation of energy in the system that comes with anxiety. If you've ever felt yourself in an anxious space, if you've ever felt yourself in a fearful space, you will know just how much is liberated into your system in terms of energy. It's a huge amount. And the reason for that is a legitimate and a useful one, because anxiety is us exercising our superpower of predicting the future in advance. And so in the face of that perceived threat, what's required is that we are able to produce enough energetic momentum, physically, emotionally, and mentally, to be able to remove ourselves from the situation in question so we can rest and reset. Now, in a perfect world, that arousal cycle would flow fluidly and easily. But in the modern world, where we are actually very limited in the actual amount of physical threat that we face, and most of the stresses that we experience are actually mental or emotional, we often find ourselves where it's not appropriate nor are we able to move that energy through in a physical way. And what we have as a consequence of that is us in this anxious space where we feel incredibly threatened. We feel incredibly vulnerable, physically as well. It charges the central nervous system. So this is it's a trauma reaction in and of itself. But it charges the central nervous system, even if the reality is that we are perfectly safe. Now, if you don't have the skills to deal with that, right? If you don't have the skills to be able to calm yourself down, to switch yourself from a sympathetic nervous system activation to a parasympathetic nervous system activation, if you can't control or don't know how to control the thoughts which are coursing through your brain space that are causing constant anticipation anxiety to arise, then you put yourself in a state of chronic activation. And this is incredibly depleting on the system. It is an exhausting state to be in, and it results in behaviors and feeling states that are secondary to the actual cause. And anger is one of the best ones to arise because it's the easiest to access and the one that feels often most valid in the moment. So the problem then, of course, arises when if we think back to this energetic liberation in the system, this activation of the sympathetic nervous system, when the anxiety response is not appropriate for the moment, or the other option is we're unable to remove ourselves physically, mentally, or emotionally in order to find relief. What we're left with is this high octane emotion floating around our body, searching for an outlet. And one of the most obvious and easily available routes of discharge is through anger. Let's talk about anger then, because anger is such a beautiful emotion. They're all beautiful, but really misunderstood. Yeah. So I think that what we do is we have very, what's the word I'm searching for? Narrow. We have very narrow understandings of emotions. And things like anger, fear, anxiety, frustration, confusion, those sorts of emotional states are ones that we would typically go out of our way to avoid. However, they are so necessary. They are so necessary for healthy functioning. They are so necessary for us to be able to move through the world in a way that has our best interests at heart and allows us to be empathetic creatures. And anger is no different to that. Anger at its essence is a protector. And when we're using our anger healthily and productively, it really allows us to set boundaries and preserve what's important to us. If you think back to a time where you felt angry, often it's because you felt slighted in some way. And the extreme manifestation of anger, where it manifests as rage or it manifests as something which is, it feels like it's kind of consuming us or taking us over, that usually comes about because we've ignored the very early precursors of anger that are showing up in a much more diluted state. If you aren't firm with boundaries, for instance, if you aren't firm with saying what it is that you need, if you feel like you have this permeable outline that everyone else is taking advantage of and you're being pulled in every which way direction, then often we get to a stage where we're compromised, and then all of a sudden we kind of blow out because we just can't take it anymore. And that's our typical association with anger. That endpoint frame where we've lost all control to be able to say how it is we want to express something and to be able to adequately and appropriately express our needs. And as a consequence, we kind of just go off the boil and everything goes to pot. When we're using our anger healthily and productively, it really allows us to set those boundaries and to preserve what is important to us. And if you can think about anger like that as a protector, as a boundary enforcer, when we feel exposed or we're unable to cope with what is going on internally, anger often steps forward as an emotional bodyguard. Now, thinking of this situation that I brought up in the first place, which was we have someone at a competition who's feeling a huge amount of anxiety, and I think most of us will be able to empathise or to put ourselves in her shoes in some shape or form. What you have is a huge amount of vulnerability there, and what you have is a huge feeling that relates to a lack of safety, right? That may not be true for the moment. We're not suggesting that she's in a physically compromised position, but anxiety doesn't differentiate between that. The feelings that are liberated in the system as a consequence of the amygdala firing off the anxiety response mean that we feel physically under threat. And if we, for whatever reason, feel like we don't have choices in that moment, and this is all perception, I'm not saying this is reality, but if we feel like we don't have choices or the options to remove ourselves from the situation and relieve the stresses that we currently feel under aren't available to us, then a really easy place to go is to anger. That becomes a liberation point, especially towards people who we feel like are enforcing the boundaries or the parameters that we don't want to be in, or who we feel like are compromising us in some way. Again, perceived, not real. But when you're in that space, the ability to negotiate that internal climate becomes compromised because the pressure is so much on, the discharge of energy is so high that it just feels all too much. Rather than be forced into a corner then, rather than us say, look, this is how I'm feeling, which takes a huge amount of maturity. And then further on from that, these are the skills that I have to deal with this. Again, often we don't have them. Often they're not practiced. And this is all of the stuff that I'm doing in my membership program, Joyride, or just generally that I'm working with all the time when I'm working with people one-on-one. But in these situations, then we just do what we can. We do what we know. And often if we getting pissed off helps us feel better, we get pissed off, right? Rather than being forced into a corner where we have to look that emotion in the eye that we neither have the skill nor the strength to deal with, anger is a relief. It allows, it lets us focus away from ourselves. And let's face it, when you're feeling in those situations, that's a pretty good place to go, or it seems like that in the moment. So then other people become this unwitting or undeserved earth point for this electrical charge that is coursing within us. Now, this isn't only true of person-to-person interactions. This is true of person-to-horse interactions. And if anger or losing your temper or feeling kind of like, oh, why isn't this working, is your modus operandi or your go-to place when you run out of options also, this is really important to consider because anger is coming through as an enforcer, as a protector, but it is hiding something that is lying beneath. It could be that you're out of skills, that you feel ashamed, that you feel frustrated, whatever it is. We really want to understand, yes, anger's coming forward. No, it's not appropriate. No, it will never be appropriate. However, if we really want to predict the future in advance and say, this is where I go in this situation, we have to look at what motivates that. We have to get vulnerable with ourselves and say, what really is going on here? Like, if I could think of one thing that would fix this, that is about me, what is it that would be, and that deep dive is hard work. It's hard work, not in that it's like toil, but it's tough. It's tough to look at yourself like that and admit the stuff that's causing you to feel vulnerable, and then to recognize that there's work that we can do to remedy that. It's not easy work. The shame around it as well is something that we have to get pretty au fait with, because one of the quick places that we go to is to think that there's something wrong with us inherently. And when we think there's something wrong with us inherently, and we're coming from a fixed mindset position, which tells us that this is a lot that we're born with and we can't do anything about this, then obviously we feel like we have to cover up or present some kind of mask to the world so that we're kind of okay. And that can come again through many of unwanted means emotionally. Response then, how do we deal with this? Because if we're in a situation where we're finding ourselves as the earth point in this dynamic, I am also not suggesting that we simply stand there and take it. Obviously, that's not something that I would recommend. But in order to really be able to diffuse it, it is necessary to first understand the motivation behind the anger and its source, so that we're not just there kind of mopping up water instead of turning off the tap. Responding to anger with anger, where's that going to get us? We know that only magnifies the situation. But if we understand the underlying vulnerability, it becomes much easier to maintain an emotional distance and to not fuse ourselves with the experience. That separateness then, that allows us to question the deeper hurt, and that furthermore, really, that distancing and punishment is only going to drive that anxiety deeper within and magnify the shame if that's relevant, and usually it is, and strengthen the defensive mechanisms that support it, right? So then, how do we do that? Inward-focused communication, self-focused communication is, in my opinion, one of the best tools that we have. For instance, let's just use this example of a mother and daughter combination at competition. Let's pretend that the daughter is feeling incredibly upset on the inside. The way that that's presenting to the world is in a really angry and pissed off way. And naturally, when you are on the receiving end of someone behaving like that, it's a tough gig to rise up. I'm not suggesting that I'm any kind of sage in this situation or that it doesn't require a deep breath on my part too. So I am with you on this. We are all in this together. But what needs to happen is that empathy trigger needs to be set off by saying, I know what's going on here. How is it that I can actually help this situation rather than hinder it? And self-focused communication would look like something like this. It's firstly establishing your bottom line. So although someone can be hurt, someone can be angry, someone can be upset, it's still not an excuse to talk to you in a way that is unacceptable or rude or unkind. That's never acceptable. So establishing your bottom line is a good start. The second part is really just coming from a place of communicating what it is that you need. So I'm just pulling this off the top of my head, so we might have to wiggle with this a little bit or play around with it a little bit. I might say, let's pretend that my daughter's name is Sarah. And I might say something like this: Sarah, I completely appreciate that you are upset, and this is a really tough situation to be in. I know when I've been at competitions myself that I've felt anxiety, and I know how overwhelming that feeling can be. However, when we are together and when I am here to help you and do what it is that we ultimately want to do together, which is come to this competition and have a good time, it's unacceptable for you to talk to me that way. And what I need to establish is some ground rules for us so that we're able to move through this place in a way that's respectful and kind to both of us, because I find that I can't stay in this situation and feel good when you are talking to me like that. So when you're ready to come back and communicate in a way that's respectful and kind, I am absolutely here because I 100% want to support you and hear what you have to say. I'm just not open to being communicated with like that. So you can see that communicating in that way or having that kind of conversation is diffusing in that you're outlining what you need. It's not okay to be talked to like that. You understand what it is that's going on. However, the bottom line for you is that if this is the way that the communication is going to pan out, you're not available for that. What you are available for is having a kind conversation, hearing what she has to say, supporting her in any way you can. And that is an empathetic, clear, and kind way of saying, not okay, this is what's okay, get back to me when you're ready. And that also means that you have enforced a boundary around yourself about what is acceptable behaviour and what is not for you. You haven't bought into the situation, so you've expressed empathy and understanding about where ultimately that distress or where that anger is coming from. You are available to talk to, so it's not like a deadline where it's like, go away and have a think about it. It's like, come back to me when you're ready to talk about this because I really want to support you. So the door is still open, but there are parameters around how and where this communication is going to play out. Now, on the other side, that awareness and ability to really communicate in a way that is clear, kind, and effective when you're feeling vulnerable is a practiced one. And the first step is the awareness of emotional discernment, which is, What are the very first indications that I'm feeling angry? And how is it, that I'm feeling anxious? And how is it that I can ask for help? Now, the help formula is to ask early. This is not mine, but I can't remember where I got it from. I got it from someone else that I listened to, and I apologize for not being able to credit them. But it's to ask early, ask often, and ask kindly, right? So asking early means that as soon as you feel a hint of concern about what it is that you're going through, so in the case of the daughter, Sarah, if I'm in Sarah's position, I would be like, oh, Mum, I'm thinking about that competition next weekend and I'm feeling concerned about it. So that's communicating early. Now, when you're communicating early, you can communicate kindly because you're not in a situation where you're completely under the pump. As soon as you're under the pump, kindness tends to be the last thing that goes out the window because there's a sense of urgency, physically and mentally, for you to get your word across, for you to get your point across. And that's where we tend to snap. That's where we tend to do things in ways that don't ultimately line up with how it is that we want to be. The asking often is really key as well, because if we're asking often, we're making sure that we're not an island. And anxiety, and especially when there's shame attached to it, tends to isolate us and make us feel like we're somehow out on little no man's island over here, when actually communicating with people how it is that you feel allows that connection to arise and dissolves that, wall that we create between ourselves that we're somehow different or flawed in some way. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics of how it is you deal with anxiety in this particular podcast, but there are very specific skills that are highly effective in dealing with anticipation anxiety and repatterning trauma that is resulting in anxiety. And the reason that I'm not going to go into that now is because I really like to do that with the person. So Joyride absolutely does that. We're able to nut through that, but it's not something that I want to give like a suggestion of a quick fix to, because although there are things which can turn things around immediately, it's just my preference to kind of do that in a much more comprehensive way when we're kind of paying attention to all the different parts. But to think about this from a communication perspective, that anxiety piece is really key, and being able to say, look, I just don't feel I'm in a good place right now. Like, this is really concerning to me. What is it that I need to feel confident? And asking yourself empowering questions is such an amazing place to begin from, because asking yourself empowering questions means that you get yourself into the mindset where potential or positive possibility arises. And you also start to search your brain space for solutions that are available to you. For example, asking yourself, what is it that I need to feel confident right now, actually gets you thinking in a way that moves you towards confidence. It is a high quality question. It presupposes that confidence is available to you, and there are certain things that you can move through that will allow that to be manifest in your reality. A low quality question would be, why does this always happen to me? And basically what the mind does is search for ways to make you right. It's always wanting to provide you with the right answer. So the right answer to why does this always happen to me, your mind goes, why does this always happen to me? And then you might go, well, because I'm just not cut out for it, or I don't have the horsepower, or I don't have the skills to do this. Low quality questions breed low quality answers, and they send us on this downward spiral where the itty bitty shitty committee just have an absolute field day, and we end up camping full time in Camp Crappy rather than coming back to a place where we're like, I get that this is a moment in time. I get that this feeling space is inviting me to really contract down around the pain, when actually what I have to do is open my mind enough to be able to point towards resources, to be able to ask for the help that I need, and to be able to get the support that I need to feel like I'm in a good space to move forward towards the next step. The call is really to look a little bit deeper, to make sure that if you are on the receiving end of anger, to try and understand what the motivation is behind that, especially if it's fueled by anxiety, to really get a bit more curious about the interplay of emotions, because it's such a fascinating topic, and to realize these are skills, guys. If there's anything I can tell you, emotional navigation, agility, being able to do everything that I am talking about is a skill. It's not something that you missed out on. It's not something that you're born with. It's something that we need to learn. And if we haven't learned it, then how are we supposed to know it? It's just like anything else. So if you can let go of any taboos or associations that you might have around doing this kind of work on a psychological, on a mental, on an emotional, on an intuitive level, and just say, these are skills that are perhaps the primary skills that I need to be learning in the world, then you get yourself into a place of ultimate liberation, because you are in control of your head and heart space, and you are able to decide what the purpose is behind the emotions that you're feeling and whether to act on them or not. Such a cool topic. I could honestly go on about it all day. I'll attach the article that I wrote as well for those of you who are wanting to read through a bit of a summary or get some more information. And as for these emotional interplays, there's something that I'm working with and talking about all the time. So if this is your thing, if you're like, man, I really need some help with the anxiety stuff that's going on or understanding more about this, then I really encourage you to join my online program, Joyride. You can do that on my website, confidentwriter.online/joyride. And as per normal, I'm here for questions. If you want to ping me a message on my Instagram at confident_writer or on Facebook at The Confident Writer. You can email me, giving you lots of stuff to do, huh? Basically, help is here if you need it. I'm more than happy to give it. I love talking about this stuff, and it's something that I am super passionate about. So hit me up if need be. All right, guys, have a fabulous day. And as per, I will talk to you in the next episode.